9. Shatavia Walls. While living at a public housing complex in the Brooklyn neighborhood of East New York, Shatavia Walls was shot by a member of the Loopy Gang in July of 2020. 2 years later, she testified against the suspects in federal court. During the trial, gang members hung flies throughout Shatavia's building, branding her a rat. On the 4th of July that year, Shatavia got into a confrontation over fireworks with some members of the 9Ds gang, which is closely associated with the Loopy Gang. During the face-off, gang member Maliek Miller allegedly shot a gun in the air and called Shatavia a snitch. 3 days after the incident, 2 men gunned Shatavia down while she walked on a path near the housing complex. The 33-year-old was rushed to the hospital where she died 10 days later. Authorities accused 4 9Ds members of planning the shooting, but placed the majority of the blame on a man named Quentin Green and an unnamed accomplice who was suspected to be the gunman. Federal prosecutors alleged that the shooters waited around all day for their victim, changing their outfits several times in order to remain inconspicuous. Then, when Shatavia exited the building, one of the men approached her from behind. The two of them exchanged some words, and then a bullet was fired at the woman, which missed and struck an uninvolved bystander. Shatavia ran, but the perpetrator followed and continued shooting. Without realizing it, she headed straight in the direction of the second gunman and found herself at the mercy of both suspects. After gunning down their victim, the suspects fled to Queens, where another accomplice gave them a place to hide. Altogether, 3 men were indicted for murder, while the man who harbored them afterward faced an accessory to murder charge. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of the tragedy is that former Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams had recently urged residents to talk to their neighbors about fireworks before calling the police. Unfortunately, in Shatavia's case, it was the wrong choice. 8. Sconding Gas. After becoming a confidential informant in 2020, 50-year-old Sconding Gas met with James Skirnovitz, a 53-year-old detective who was working to bust a drug operation in Cleveland, Ohio. The pair were sitting in the detective's unmarked vehicle late one night when out of nowhere they were shot dead. Immediately after the double murder, an anonymous police source told the Associated Press that Skirnovitz was working on the case undercover. At the time, the detective was in the process of transitioning from a gang unit under the Cleveland Police Department to the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force. It was unclear which agency Skirnovitz was working for and who Dinges was passing on information to when the shooting occurred. 3 suspects were ultimately charged in connection with the murders. In a shocking twist, prosecutors conceded that the trio were unaware that they were shooting at a detective and an informant, but that the violence occurred during a robbery gone wrong. Unfortunately, it was during their work trying to catch bad guys that they inevitably fell into the path of a different group of criminals. An underage defendant who didn't fire any of the shots but was still involved in the crime pleaded guilty to 2 counts of aggravated murder. He'll remain behind bars until he's at least 21 years old. In 2022, 19-year-old Kevin Robinson was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder and 2 counts of robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years. 20-year-old David McDaniel also faces murder charges but is still waiting for his sentencing. His trial is set for late 2022, and if convicted, he could face the death penalty. 7. Anthony Lawrence. In early 2018, a reclusive loner named Anthony Lawrence broke into his neighbor's home in East Yorkshire, England. Armed with a crossbow, he shot arrows into 30-year-old Shane Gilmer and his pregnant girlfriend, 22-year-old Laura Sugden. The couple had just returned home from dinner at an Italian restaurant when they suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives. Laura, who was shot in the head, begged the intruder to let her and her unborn baby live, but he said he wasn't going to leave until he was sure they were dead. She wrestled with Lawrence, then decided that her best hope of surviving was to play dead. Suddenly, Lawrence stopped the attack and left. Miss Sugden would later say at an inquest that she thinks her attacker felt he'd done enough damage to kill her and that she would soon die. Shane, who was clinging to life, told Laura to run and get help. She made it to a neighbor's house as Lawrence got into his car and fled the scene. Thankfully, Laura and her baby survived, but unfortunately, Shane passed away from his injuries. A manhunt team found Lawrence dead in a motorhome several days later. The coroner concluded that he took his life in an intentional overdose. In doing so, he managed to avoid facing justice for his crimes. 6. Wendy Chaney. After learning that 39-year-old Wendy Chaney was cooperating with state and federal drug authorities, members of the Black Gorilla family gang were contracted to have her killed. The individuals who ordered the hits allegedly promised the hired killers Gerald Adgerbason and Devin Dickerson $20,000 cash and any drugs and guns they found at the murder scene. In 2016, they were sent from Baltimore to a barn in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, but they found Chaney along with 47-year-old Brandon Cole and 36-year-old Philip Jackson. Adgerbason and Dickerson zip-tied the victims' hands behind their backs, shot them dead, and then set their bodies on fire. The suspects never found the money that was promised to them, but they did find and steal some guns and drugs from the property. A 6-year investigation ensued as authorities worked to get to the bottom of the brutal crime. Numerous individuals were ultimately charged and convicted in connection with the disturbing murder-for-hire plot. Dickerson pleaded guilty to drug charges, while Adgerbason pleaded guilty to participating in the murders. According to the last update, Adgerbason had not yet been sentenced, but faced up to a lifetime behind bars. 5. John Dowry. When 36-year-old Maryland resident John Dowry Jr. found himself facing up to a decade behind bars for drug and gun charges in 2004, he knew a conviction was likely. Realizing that his best bet for avoiding prison was to cooperate with authorities, the father of 9 children turned state's witness in a federal murder case. In exchange for Dowry's help, the feds lightened up on his restrictions, allowing him to go to rehab and to continue living and working in East Baltimore without spending any time behind bars. However, his fresh start was cut short one morning in 2005 when he arrived home from his factory job. While waiting at the front door for his girlfriend to let him inside their apartment, 2 men approached Dowry from behind and shot him. He ran, but the shooters chased after him and shot him 6 times. The man eventually made it into his home and collapsed on the floor with gunshot wounds to his arms, legs, and back. Surgeons miraculously managed to save his life, but the incident made it clear that Dowry was a known snitch and that his life was in danger. He left the area and kept a low profile until Thanksgiving 2006, when he returned to East Baltimore to celebrate the holiday with his family. During the festivities, Dowry went to a nearby convenience store to buy beer and cigarettes. He was there for a very short time before someone entered and shot him in the head execution style. It took some convincing, but after finally getting witnesses to talk, law enforcement charged drug traffickers Melvin Gilbert and Darren Goods with the murder. They were both sentenced to life without parole, but either way, Dowry's loved ones were forced to carry on without him in the aftermath of his needless death. 4. Milton Womack. 60-year-old Milton Womack was employed with a home healthcare agency in New Orleans when he caught federal charges in connection with a healthcare fraud scheme that was going on at his workplace in 2012. In short, high-ranking staff members worked together to steal millions of dollars from Medicare for services that were never performed. Womack negotiated with prosecutors and agreed to plead guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for his testimony against Lewis H. Jr., who was accused of being the mastermind behind the scam. In July 2012, before he was scheduled to plead guilty, Womack was shot dead while sitting in his truck. Prosecutors blamed H. Jr. for ordering the hit and his son Lewis H. III of planning it. A local gang member named Stanton Guillory was accused of pulling the trigger. Womack's death did not prevent H. Jr. or H. III from being convicted in the fraud case, and on top of it, they faced charges in connection with the murder for hire. All 3 suspects and an additional accomplice, Ronald Wilson Jr., were convicted of numerous charges related to the murder. They were all sentenced to life in federal prison for their crimes. Everyone declined to speak at the sentencing except Guillory, who asserted his innocence. 3. Susan Cooper. When a woman from Arkansas named Susan Cooper found herself in hot water with federal law enforcement in 2016, she agreed to work off her charges by cooperating as an informant. The information she provided led investigators to an alleged methamphetamine dealer named Samuel Sherman, who also agreed to work with authorities. However, the details he was able to provide weren't enough to help his case, and he faced a significant amount of time behind bars. Sherman then called up a friend, Donald Bill Smith, who was also a meth dealer and had a history of selling drugs to Susan Cooper's sister-in-law, Rachel Cooper. Sherman, Smith, and Rachel Cooper worked together to coordinate a deal with Susan, who thought she was going to trade some hydrocodone pills for meth. Rachel picked Susan up and drove her to the site for the planned drug deal. But when they got there, Smith emerged and shot Susan multiple times. He pulled her out of the car as Rachel panicked and sped away, seemingly unaware that the plan had been to kill Susan all along. Her body wasn't found until a year and a half later, when an informant told detectives that Smith had forced them to help bury Susan. The man then led police to the location of her grave in a pasture. Smith and Sherman were convicted on a slew of charges, including conspiracy to cause witness tampering resulting in death along with several other crimes. They were both sentenced to life in federal prison, which automatically comes with no parole. 2. Khalif Systrom. After witnessing his friend be shot to death in Philadelphia in 2018, Khalif Systrom testified against the suspect in court. His testimony helped to secure a voluntary manslaughter conviction against 18-year-old Zamir White, who received a minimum prison sentence of 24 years. He also spoke to the police about his brother's murder in a drive-by shooting, which remains unsolved to this day. Khalif endured repeated harassment from White's associates who accused him of being a snitch. According to his relatives, he was targeted with gunfire at least 8 times over a 2-year period. In one incident, a gunman shot at the young man's FedEx delivery truck, seriously injuring his co-worker. Tragedy struck again in late 2020, when Khalif was shot while sitting on his dirt bike near Philadelphia's City Hall. Unfortunately, the 21-year-old died from his injuries. His loved ones are convinced that the shooting was carried out by the people who were after him for testifying against White, but Khalif's murder still has yet to be solved. 1. Kenneth Moore. One day in 2016, Kenneth Moore was relaxing in his car outside his apartment complex in Richmond, Virginia, when he saw 2 men ride up on bikes. One of them pulled out a gun and fired multiple bullets toward the building. Focused on his own safety, Moore fled inside, unaware that one of the bullets had pierced the windshield of a parked car and killed 52-year-old Carmela Winston. Investigators theorized that Carmela was not the shooter's intended target and that they were initially at a loss to identify her killer. Acting on an anonymous tip about a possible suspect, they went door to door throughout Kenneth's building, asking residents if they'd seen any activity that might be connected to the crime. Not wanting to be branded as a snitch, Kenneth was hesitant to say much, but he knew that what he saw might be helpful. He told detectives to focus their efforts in a nearby alleyway, where they subsequently found numerous shell casings. The detectives returned to Kenneth's apartment and prodded him for more information, at which point he reluctantly admitted that he'd seen the shooter. He also claimed he'd be able to identify the suspect if he saw him again. Kenneth identified George Trevor Watson Scott from a photo lineup, and it was enough for law enforcement to charge the man with second-degree murder. Testimony from Kenneth and his wife ultimately helped to secure a conviction against Scott, and the judge overseeing the case sentenced him to 40 years behind bars. However, a few weeks after the trial, some men approached Kenneth's car outside a supermarket and threw a brick through his window. He sped off before they could attack him, but at that point he knew he was being targeted. Feeling as if they had no other choice, Kenneth and his wife Shamik Massey packed their belongings and their 4 kids and moved to an undisclosed location outside the area. They received some financial help from local law enforcement, but were still left struggling from the costs of uprooting and starting completely over in a new place. As much as the ordeal complicated Kenneth's life, he doesn't regret his decision to help law enforcement. Speaking with the Washington Post, he said that he felt he did the right thing despite the difficulties that came along with it. If you were subpoenaed to testify against a dangerous criminal and were given the choice, would you enter witness protection or would you risk being a revenge target in order to stay near your home and loved ones? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time. Bye.